Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's Owning Rent Control Property in Santa Monica seminar. This is one of several seminars that we put on during the year. We just did one for tenants a few weeks ago, and we do one with the city's code enforcement division on the maintenance of rent controlled properties. And we also do one with the city attorney's office, the landlord tenant forum that is usually in December. And all of these seminars are recorded, and today's seminar will be recorded as well. And we'll be posting it on our website. Uh, we'll give you the website address later if you don't know it, but there is a seminar and newsletters page, and you can just click there and you can refer back to this seminar if there's something you want to check again. It does take a couple of days for us to put up the seminar, so it may be later this week or very early next week before we have the seminar posted. So, sorry. So my name is Dan Costello. I am the Public Information Manager for Rent Control, and today I'm joined by two of our public information staff, Jenny Min, who is an information coordinator, and Micah Machalski, who's an information coordinator. The public information team is the group that is sort of the public face of the agency. We are the people who are answering your phone calls, your emails, and we'll meet with you if you come down to City Hall. And we're always available no matter which method you want to try to reach us. And we really encourage you, if you have questions, to contact us. That's why we're here. So with that, we have quite a long presentation today. There's a lot of detail to cover, and you may have questions as we go along. So I did want to begin by pointing out how you can ask questions using the chat function in the BlueJeans app. So on the upper right-hand side of your screen, you should see a blue icon with a person and a little message icon. You can click there and then type in your question in the box down below. So that will populate the event chat, and we will stop during the presentation after various sections to answer your questions. It may be that we are going to cover some of the material that you're asking about later on in the presentation. So if we don't respond immediately to your question, it doesn't mean that we're going to skip over that. We will address it later. We would like you to ask questions of general interest. If you have questions about very specific situations that you're having with your tenants, then it would be better for you to contact one of the information coordinators directly and ask that question to them. And another thing I'd like to point out is, just so that there's no confusion, we would ask that you, as participants, not answer the questions yourself. We would like the questions that are put into the event chat to be answered by us. That way, if somebody gets information, they know that it came from us and maybe not from somebody else who may or may not know the correct answer. So with that, I'll go on to the topics for today. I'm going to begin by introducing our Civics portal application. This is the result of several years of work we've done on developing a new database, and it has a public-facing portal that allows owners and property managers and tenants to file various documents with us. And I'll go over the types of documents that you can file and a couple of tips and tricks on how to submit the forms that you want to submit. Then we'll go on to talk about rent control in general. What is rent control? Some of you may or may not know. I think we have some long-term tenants or long-term owners here, and some newer names that I don't recognize from the attendee list. So We'll give you a general overview of what rent control is. Also, what is the maximum lawful rent? So that's a key thing. Rent control is all about the rent that may lawfully be charged to tenants. Then we'll talk about a couple of the administrative remedies that tenants can avail themselves of, and owners have some petitions as well that they can file with the board for certain circumstances, and we'll cover what those are. We'll review what the eviction protections are for tenants, including giving you a kind of current state of affairs for the eviction moratoria that were related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and where we are today, what things remain. And then finally, we'll talk about the limitations on the change of use of rent-controlled units. Rent-controlled units are supposed to be, for the long-term habitation of tenants, and there are just a couple of ways that owners can remove those units. Otherwise, they remain subject to the rent control law. So with that, I'll go back to I'm going to switch to our civics application, which I hope you are seeing on your screen now. I will note that sometimes there's a little delay in when the video changes after as we're changing slides, so just be patient. So our civics application can be found at rentcontrol.santamonica.gov. And it's very similar to our email address, which is rentcontrol@santamonica.gov, but this is rentcontrol.santamonica.gov. And to use the system, you do need to have a user account. So when you come to rentcontrol.santamonica.gov, you can scroll down to, I'm already logged in, so let me log out to show you. Sorry, one second. Yeah, you can click the link at the bottom of the page for creating a profile. And this will take you to a simple form where you can enter your basic contact information. And then as property owners and managers, you can list the properties that you own or manage. And then once you've done that, we will set up an account for you and associate your account to the properties that you own or manage so that they will appear on your dashboard. It may take us a couple of days to do this because we do need to check who actually owns the property, or if it's a property manager, if you are duly authorized by the owner to submit documents on their behalf. But once we do that, you'll get an email from Hanson@smgov.net with a temporary password that you can use to log into your account. You then change your password, and then you can begin submitting documents through the system. We already have about 900 users, many of whom are property owners and managers, because as we'll talk about, there are some registration requirements, and so property owners and managers really can utilize the system to satisfy some of those registration requirements. So you'll have an email, which is your user account. Mine's already entered, and I'm going to enter my password. And then it's going to take me to my dashboard if I typed in the right password, and I did. And here you'll see at the top, there are some tabs, My Dashboard. There's a way to look up a record, and then there's a way to submit a record. You'll also see that there's a fees section. Rent control normally doesn't have fees for any applications that you file. However, as we'll talk about, there is a registration fee that needs to be paid to rent control annually to fund the operations of the agency. And when we do that, which is always in the summertime, and it's due by August 1st, you'll see that this fees section is populated with an amount owed for the properties that are associated with your account. And you can use the system to pay the fees. So it's very convenient. It's a great online way of doing it. And let me just now show you what some of the things you can do, some of the forms that you can submit with a Civics account. One of the forms that we get the most of is the tenancy registration form. So each new tenancy needs to be registered with us. And so you'll find that listed at the top of the form section. And then we have 3 other sections with reports within them. Registration forms, so adding an amenity, and we'll talk about that today. Authorizing an agent or property managers to submit things on your behalf as an owner. A change of mailing address for the owner, and then an ownership registration. So if there is a change in ownership, that can be filed through the, Civics. We also have several types of fee waivers that can be filed through Civics. I mentioned the rent control registration fee, but in some cases, you can get a waiver of that fee. Some of the fee waivers are applied for by tenants. So the Clean Beaches and Ocean Parcel Tax waiver, the low income disabled tenant fee waiver, and the senior. And then for owners, we have an owner occupied fee waiver. So if you live on your property and you have at least a 25% interest, you can file an owner occupied fee waiver and we won't charge a fee for your unit. Also, if you have a Section 8 tenant, you can file that here. And any changes in Section 8 tenants also need to be, you have to request a unique waiver for each one of those Section 8 tenants. And then for single family homes or separately sold condominiums, there's also a waiver. There are also 3 different exemption types that can be filed through the system. The most common of which we have is the owner occupied exemption for properties of 3 units or fewer. And then we have 2 that are related to single family dwellings. The first is for one that has been owner occupied for at least 2 years. And then the owner can submit an application that is reviewed by the Rent Control Board, and the property could be deemed permanently exempt after that. And a single family dwelling 1815 declaration. 1815 is the section of the charter, and that says that if the unit wasn't used for a residential rental purpose on July 1st of 1984, then it can be exempt as a single family dwelling. So let me go quickly to the tenancy registration form. And you'll note there are instructions at the top here, and it would be a very good idea for you to read these instructions to avoid some of the problems that we're seeing with people filing the forms. But essentially what you're going to do is select the category, and since you have to register tenancies after January 1st, 1999, that's generally what you're going to select. So you select the category of that, and then the next thing you do on this screen, and it's the only thing you do on this screen after that, is to add a primary site. And this tells us what is the address of the unit that you want to register. Here's the tip for you. So the easiest way to do this is merely to enter the street number and the street name, and then scroll down and press search. Search. And then you will see the units that are related to, or that the units that are related to that property. And you'll notice that there is a unit designation after the street number and name. And if that's the unit that you want to register, you just click that radio button and select it. Now you'll see that the site has been added to this page. To go on to it, you go save and continue. And you'll notice at the top here, you're moving through these tabs. So now we're on 3, and the system is asking for basic information about this tenancy. Each one, or the information is organized into these sections. So form details, so what unit number, this is just to double check that we've got the right unit. Owner name and manager name. Note that the fields that have a red asterisk are required fields. So if you try to submit the form without filling out that field, it won't let you, and you'll have to go back and fill in the information. We're looking for basic tenancy information. When did the tenancy begin? Because of the limitations of this system, It also asks for a time. So you'll see this hours, minutes thing. You can enter anything in there just to move on. And it just helps us organize entries in the history of the rents in case there are two changes within the same day. You enter the monthly rent. This is what we'll call the maximum allowable rent, and it doesn't include any registration fee pass-throughs, which are allowed in certain circumstances, or surcharges from the property tax bill that are available to tenants who moved in before March 1st of 2018. We'll talk more about that. The total rent collected, really meaning the initial monthly rent plus the registration fee plus any surcharges, but not including any security deposit money. This is only the rent, okay? And then there's a basic question of what type of tenancy are you registering? And for most cases, it's always going to be the standard tenancy registration. We have a few other unique situations like a tenant who no longer has a Section 8 contract or some other situations. But for the most part, you're just going to be entering a standard tenancy information. Then we have parking. That's the only amenity that we ask you to register at the start of a tenancy. There's a drop down to say yes or no, does this tenant have parking? And then you need to enter the type of parking. And to do that, you click the plus button on the add row, and then you can select from the drop down, say this is a covered one with 2 spots, and then you save that. We also ask for when prior tenants vacated and the reason. And then we have what's called the certification of information section, which is really your digital signature on your form. And it does require that you give the rent control information sheet, which we'll talk about later, to the tenant, enter your name, the date, and then you can save and continue. You also have to say yes, that you agree to all this. Save and continue. It's not going to let me because I have not filled out everything that I should have. So once you have done that, and by the way, you can begin filling out a form and then save your progress and come back later. So that's fine. I'm going to save this and come back later. And now I'm going to go to my dashboard. So as I said, we will set up your dashboard, but whenever you submit one of these forms, it's going to appear on your own dashboard. So let me click it. Oh, all right. So now all of the forms that I have submitted are appearing on my dashboard and the date that I added them. The ones that are the tenancy registration forms, for example, that are open have not been completed, and I can continue and go and finish that form if I haven't before. The forms that are finished are identified with this form number. It's 10 reg, the year, and then a sequence number. And you can click on one of these to get to a version of the form that you have filed. So I'm going to click on this one. And it's going to bring back a version of what I had entered before. Here you'll see the sections again, so information about the tenancy, the form details. You can open up each one of these sections. They're closed by default. And then this is a really important thing. Down at the bottom, you'll see attachments. And you can download these attachments. And hopefully it will, not sure if you'll be able to see it. I hope so. I'm hoping now, can you see this tenancy registration form? So when you file a tenancy registration form, it stays open for 1 hour in case you want to make a change to it. After 1 hour, every 30 minutes, the system runs a batch job and it generates a facsimile of the information that you provided. And this is something that you can then download or print and keep in your files. But remember, they're also always going to be on your dashboard. So that's the basic thing about submitting a tenancy registration form. I also want to show you that on a dashboard, you will have a link to the site summary, we call it, for each one of the properties that are associated to your account. And I'll show you one of those. Because there's some really good information under the Site Master tab as well. It does take a little while to load some of these forms, but here you'll see this is general information about this property. For example, we should have, the general information about how many units are on the property, when it was registered, if it's properly registered, the mailing information that we have for this property. And then one of the very useful things, I think, in the attachments section, just as there was for the tenancy registration form, there are some things that you can download. For example, the report of maximum allowable rents. That's a report that we send each summer informing you how much you can increase the rents per the general adjustment. And that's available to you right on your Civics dashboard. So hopefully you're seeing a report of maximum allowable rents here. So we often get calls for people to resend a form, but with the Civics account, you'll always be able to see it. We'll also talk today about some of the other ways that you can get information from us. So with that, we'll go on to all right. Oh, coming around here. Okay, we'll go on to the main part of the presentation today. There are many, many things that have to do with the landlord-tenant relationship. Some are covered by the rent control law. Some things are covered by state law. Other things are covered by the municipal code. And today we really want to focus on those things that are in the rent control law. Our information coordinators can provide general information about state law or the municipal code, but we are really not the best source for that information because we're essentially trained in the rent control law. Some of the state law issues are the return of the security deposit. How much do I have to give back to the tenant? What can I withhold? Those things are not specified in the rent control law. Neither are things like the right of the landlord to enter the unit or the eviction procedures, noticing period. How long do I have to give a notice to a tenant? Or if I'm going to enter, what is the method for noticing the tenant of entry? These are not things that are in the rent control law, so we avoid trying to provide specific information about that. But we do provide a referral to the State of California publication. It's called California Tenants Guide to Residential Tenants and Landlords Rights and Responsibilities. And you'll see a QR code on your screen. And I would recommend, if you're interested in this publication, just to take a picture of that with your smartphone if you can. Otherwise, you can find this on our website. But this is a really useful publication that I think is written in very easy to understand language, and it's just a great resource. Some of the municipal code issues that we're not really going to talk about today are permanent and temporary relocation. So permanent when a unit is no longer going to be occupied by the tenant for various reasons, generally a no-fault eviction of the tenant. And temporary relocation when a unit is temporarily uninhabitable. Those things are administered by the Code Enforcement Division of the city. Building code violations, also code enforcement. And then we also get questions about smoking on multifamily properties. There really isn't much in the rent control law other than to say that a violation of the smoking ordinance is not a reason to evict a tenant on its own. So just please understand there are some things that we're not going to address today. All right. So I'm going to go past civics and stop here. Excuse me, if there are any questions so far about civics, anything like that, I'm looking at the chat and I don't see anything just yet. Again, the website is rentcontrol.santamonica.gov to get a civics account. You can also scan that barcode and that will take you to the sign up page as well. Okay, seeing no questions, we'll go on to the next part of the presentation. That's a general introduction to rent control, and I will turn it over to Micah Michalski.
Right, thank you, Dan. Go ahead and get to that next slide, please. All right, so the rent control law in Santa Monica has, we like to think of it as a chair with four legs. It's got four parts, and those four legs provide stability to it. The main four parts are that all rent increases during a tenancy are controlled. Remedies are provided for situations where excess rent is charged or maintenance is neglected, or the tenant's not getting the full value for their rent dollar. There are eviction protections and the reasons that a tenancy may be terminated or limited. Change of use and the physical removal or conversion of controlled rental units is restricted. So those four things all work together to provide stability and make the rent control law work. Not all rent control jurisdictions are going to be the same. Not all of them have all four of those legs, but those are the four that the voters put in place when they passed rent control originally back in 1979. Next slide, please. So which units are, I think we went a little too far. Yeah, there we go. So which units are subject to rent control in Santa Monica? Most residential rental units in buildings that were constructed prior to April 10th of 1979 are subject to rent control. And then accessory dwelling units, those also become subject to rent control. Primary exceptions to the rent control law are most single-family homes. So that includes condominiums. Those are single-family homes or freestanding single-family homes. If they were not used for a residential rental purpose on July 1st, 1984, that's an 1815 declaration. Or if they've been owner-occupied for at least 2 years, there's an application process to get an exemption for that. Most owner-occupied properties with 3 or fewer units qualify for an exemption. That exemption must be applied for, and it does lapse if the owner moves away from the property. and then separately sold condominiums with tenancies after January 1st, 1996. Evictions would continue for those. That's particularly true if this condo was created through a TORCA conversion, the tenant ownership rights charter amendment. Those were formerly apartments. They were converted to condominiums. And then once they've been separately sold, the rent is decontrolled. But those eviction protections that exist in the rent control law continue. Next slide, please. So that three or fewer unit owner occupied exemption, there are some specific purposes for that. Obviously, three or fewer units on property. So that is on the whole parcel. It doesn't matter here if they are all touching or if they're three freestanding units. Owner living on the property must continuously own at least 50% interest in the property as a natural person. So like an LLC cannot occupy a unit and get this exemption. The owner must live continuously in one of the units as his or her principal place of residence for at least 120 days before applying. And then the exemption would lapse if the property is no longer the owner's principal place of residence, or the owner no longer owns 50% interest in the property, and the exemptions do not transfer automatically to new owners. So if ownership changes, they do need to reapply for that new exemption, that new owner. Next slide, please. All right, so we heard Dan talk about registration requirements and some of the registration features that exist in Civics. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about those a little bit. Is a title. So if the way title is held with the county changes, that needs to be updated with our system. Registration form for that. We require agent authorization forms. So if you have somebody who want to authorize to conduct business for your property, property manager, somebody like that, the owner of the property has to fill out this agent authorization form and sign it so that we know that that person is okay to file paperwork on your behalf. Registration of new tenancies and amenities. This is the number one form that people turn in with us. The feature you're going to use the most on Civics. It's just a new tenancy registration form. So and then all new tenants must also get a copy of the rent control information sheet. You'll notice a QR code there on your screen. There's a link there that'll take you directly to that form in order to be in compliance with the regulation 13002. There's a checkbox on the tenancy registration form that you have to mark to indicate that you gave the tenant this form. So that's really important. Don't forget that. If you are adding an amenity to a unit for post-1999 tenants, so anybody who moved in on or after January 1st of 1999, you are adding parking, pets, storage. You'll need to register those additional amenities. There's a form for that on the Civics portal. Hopefully, I see a message here that I'm breaking up a little bit. I hope my audio is mostly coming through pretty clear. But if not, I do apologize for that. And then just back on the presentation here. There's a requirement that registration, whenever any of these registrations are required, they must be done within 30 days. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, so what happens if I fail to register, if I don't meet that 30-day deadline? The right to implement the increase, the annual rent increase, may be restricted. A rent increase to a tenant while registration is not proper may result in the collection of excess rent until registration is proper. Rent withholding can be ordered until the landlord comes into compliance with that law that requires the registration. So it is important that get that registration paperwork done in a timely manner. All right. So not really within the scope of the rent control regulations, but important to note, the city has implemented a minimum 1-year lease term requirement. It's covered under Santa Monica Municipal Code Section 6.22, residential leasing requirements. It requires rental housing units to be rented to tenants who will use and occupy the unit as their primary residence, leased for an initial term of no less than 1 year, leased unfurnished, and they must be leased only to natural persons, so you can't lease it to an LLC or a corporation, something like that. There is a requirement within that section of the municipal code that owners must collect documentation from the tenants. Regulation, but it is something that code enforcement works on, and more information is available from the city planning department. Next slide, please. All right, so we talked a little bit about registering those additional amenities. That was for tenants that moved in on or after January 1st of 1999. For tenants that moved in before January 1st of 1999, we have something called separate agreements. And this is where property owners and tenants may negotiate a separate agreement for the monthly rental of an amenity that was not already considered a base amenity for those tenants. Separate agreements must be negotiated separate from the rental agreement. It must contain terms comparable to those of similar arrangements in an unregulated market. The creation of the agreement is not grounds for eviction. So if that either party decides that they can no longer participate in that separate agreement, the tenant can't pay for it anymore, or the landlord is no longer able to offer it, that is not something that would terminate the tenancy. Next slide, please. All right, so added amenities for post-January 1st, 1999 tenancies. This is that other registration form on the site. Property owners and tenants may agree to an additional monthly charge for the addition of parking, storage, or the right to have a pet if those things were not originally included in the lease. These are the only things that the rent control regulations allow you to have a separate and added amenity for. Like the pre-1999 tenants where a separate agreement can be reached for most other amenities, these post-1999 tenancies are limited to these three things. Once this agreement is reached and this amenity is added, it becomes a base amenity for the unit, and the original amount charged for that parking, storage, or right to have a pet becomes part of the MAR, and it is that number, so that MAR increases, and that monthly or that annual general adjustment now adjusts that whole number rather than the two separate parts. The requirements for this are that it must be part of an arm's length negotiation with no pressure on the tenant to accept the amenity. The amount paid must be comparable to lawful arrangements that are made in an unregulated market, and the owner must register the initial amount charged for the amenity with the board. Again, that's on our Civics portal. You can do that registration. We're ready for questions for this section. Are there any questions specific to this section?
All right, thank you, Micah. And sorry for the audio breaks there. I was hearing it as well. Micah, maybe you need to lean into your microphone a little bit more. But we did have a few questions. One I'm just going to go back to regarding civics, and that was, is it possible for multiple people to access the properties listed on one civic account? Yes, that is true. If someone has either we can set up multiple accounts and relate them to the same properties, or you could share your Civics account password with a coworker, for example, and then they would be able to go in. So we see that with property management companies. They have a general mailbox or general email that they use, and anyone with that email address would be able to then access the account. We had a few questions about relocation issues. Again, those aren't really our topic today, but generally, I'll just say that if code enforcement has said that the unit is temporarily uninhabitable, then the owner is required to pay temporary relocation to the tenants until they can return. There are some other arrangements that can be made, such as providing a hotel room or another unit, but those kind of things really should be directed to code enforcement. But something like a water heater, to be a habitable unit, you do have to have hot water, so that might be something that would require temporary relocation. Someone asked how they would know whether or not their property is subject to rent control. There are a few ways you can do that, but probably the easiest way is to call our office and speak with one of the information coordinators. They can look it up and tell you the status of the property. Someone asked about signs that are required. There really aren't any rent control regulations that require signage. There are probably state, and I know there are some local things in the municipal code, like the no smoking in common area signs that do have to be posted, maybe hazardous things, but those are not under rent control. I would suggest for the state things to check out that publication. We have the question, what handouts need to be given to the tenants when they start the tenancy? And Micah covered that. That is the rent control information sheet. It must be given to all new tenants who moved in after July 31st of 2017. It's available on our website. You have the QR code there, but yeah, you can always get it on our website. If you go to information by subject, and there's a link to it there. Or if you go, you follow one of the tabs for registering tenancies, there's also a link there. So somebody asked, once an amenity is added, can it ever be removed? Micah, do you want to see if you can answer that and we can hear you? Right, I'm not hearing him or seeing him, so I'll answer that for you. So we talked about pre-99 tenancies and what those base amenities are, and we talked about post-99 tenancies and what those amenities are. For everybody who moved in before 1999, we go back to the amenities that were provided on April 10th of 1978 because that's what their rent is based on. Those amenities were generally recorded with rent control on a registration form back in 1979, and we can provide you a copy of that form. It's considered to be correct. So those amenities are supposed to be maintained for all tenants who moved in before 1999. For post-99 tenants, whatever came with the unit and whatever came with the rent dollar that was set with that new tenancy are base amenities. The only ones generally that are recorded here are parking at the start of the tenancy, and then as Micah explained, if later on parking, storage, or the right to have a pet are added, those have to be registered with us and the amount charged for those amenities. An owner can remove amenities, but as we'll talk about later, tenants have a process, a petition process, to have their rent reduced because they're no longer getting the full rent dollar for what they negotiated or what their base rent is. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. If the property is not subject to rent control, no, there is no registration requirement. So don't worry about that. And then the question, if we decide to, so I don't think we addressed this later, so I'll answer it now. But well, no, I'm going to actually, I'll take that back. We are going to answer this question later on. And that, I think we'll just, let's see. Yes, somebody wanted to confirm that the rent amount can be adjusted if a pet is added. That is correct, and that is for post-99 tenancies. There is a form that you can file on Civics called an added amenity form, and you just tell us how much you and the tenant agreed to let the tenant have a pet. And emotional support animals. Getting a lot of questions here. That's good. Sorry, we're going quickly with these, but we have a lot to cover. Emotional support pets. This is really something that's covered by federal law, as I understand it, and there is a prohibition against charging an extra amount for an emotional support pet if it's been prescribed. I would suggest contacting the city attorney's office. They would be able to advise you on what federal law says about that. Someone wanted to clarify that they cannot offer a 6-month or 9-month lease. They all have to be for 1 year. That is correct. It is against the law in Santa Monica to rent for any period less than 1 year. And the reason for this is that to protect the housing supply, we want to have the housing units in the city available to tenants to live in. So not for short-term rentals. It's really intended for the long-term habitability of residents. If you own a single-family home, getting great questions here. If you own a single-family home for greater than 2 years and move out and rent out your home, then are you exempt from rent control if your application is approved? Yes, if you have a single-family dwelling and live there for 2 years and the board grants you an exemption, then you do not have to register any tenancies after that. You're exempt from rent control. Generally, single-family homes, you would be able to control the rent as well, but they would not be subject to rent control. What's the lease term requirement? We covered that, 1 year. And then someone asked about common area amenities, pools, planters, courtyard. Yes, all of these things are considered amenities. Again, if it was provided to a tenant who moved in before 1999 back in 1978, or if it's a new tenant when they moved in. So all of these things need to be maintained simply because when tenants, start their tenancies, they consider what are they getting for their rent dollar. And if you start taking away those things, then it's only fair to adjust their rent accordingly. And again, no month-to-month term. All right, with that, I think we've covered these questions, so we should move on. And we'll go on to the next section, which explains what is a maximum lawful rent. And Jenny Min will do this next section.
Hello, my name is Jenny Min, and I'll be going over the maximum lawful rent. Next slide, please. So how much can a landlord charge? That will depend on what the maximum lawful rent is. The maximum lawful rent is the maximum amount that can legally be charged for a rent-controlled unit. And a maximum lawful rent for an existing tenant is determined by adding together the following 3 components. The maximum allowable rent, also known as MAR, the registration fee pass-through, and the allowable surcharges. And I'll be going over each of the 3 components in the slides to follow. Next slide. So what is the maximum allowable rent, MAR? The maximum allowable rent is the base rent charge. It is the initial base rent plus the allowable yearly increase. The annual increase per general adjustment and the addition of certain amenities may also result in an allowable increase. It is not always the actual rent one may pay every month, since there are the two other components that could be added. We in rent control keep track of the MAR, so if you register the tenancy properly, then we would have a record of it, and you would always be able to call us and request that information. Next slide. So how is the base amenity determined? Up until 1999, all rents were based on the rent in effect on April 10th, 1978. A state law changed that, permitting market rate increases upon voluntary vacancy. So depending on when the tenants moved into their unit, the MAR will either be based on the rent charged at the start of their tenancy or on the rent in effect in 1978 plus all the subsequent increases approved by the Rent Control Board, or what the rent control law allows. For market rent tenancy, so these are tenancy that started after January 1st, 1999, the new MAR is the rent collected over the initial term. To account for any periods or free or reduced rent, we would divide the total rent collected during the initial term and divide it by the number of months on that lease term. Next slide. So what determines the amount of annual general adjustment, also known as GA? The general adjustment is an increase that is added to the MAR. And the general adjustment is based on a 75% of the annual change to the Regional Consumer Price Index, CPI, for the Los Angeles area for 12 months ending in March. The board retains the authority to apply a maximum dollar amount based on a formula in the charter. The general adjustment for this year has not been announced yet, but it will be capped at 3% due to Measure RC. If the unit qualifies and with proper written notice, the general adjustment can be implemented as early as September 1st of each year. If the owner does not implement a previous general adjustment, it does not expire and can be added with proper notice. So the general for this upcoming year, the annual increase will be effective starting September 1st. Next slide. So I'll briefly go over Measure RC. Measure RC was passed in November 2022, and this reduced the maximum general adjustment from 6% down to 3%. The adjusted MARs for units increased 6% per the September GA to 0.8% increase effective February 2023. It also adjusts the MAR for units that increased by the $140 maximum per the September GA to a $19 increase effective February 2023. And it provides a monthly increase that averages to 3% or $70, whichever is less, for the year from September 2022 to August 2023 per the board regulation. So the 2023 general adjustment will be based on qualifying MARs in effect on August 31st, 2022 plus 3% or the maximum $70. Next slide. So when can a general adjustment be taken? So as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, so you could start implementing it starting September 1st of each year or anytime after, only if all registration fees and any penalties are paid, the tenancy and properties are properly registered, the rent control information sheet is given to new tenants after 7/31/2017. There are no uncorrected citation or notice of violation of health, safety, or housing law for the unit or property. Substantial compliance with the rent control law. The owner gives proper written notice and the tenancy has been in effect for at least 12 months. Next slide. So you can find out what the MAR is for the unit. We also send the most updated MAR report each June to the property owners to help with the annual rent increases. So one of the ways you could look it up is by giving us a call, email, or coming into our office, or you could use the Look Up the Rent on our website. So if you click on Look Up a Rent, it will send you to the next page, which is the MAR database. And you could type in your street, the number and the street. And you could find this link by scanning this QR code on this page. So it will reflect what is currently in our database. So if the tenancy is not properly registered, our database will not have the most accurate information. Next slide. So the next component is the registration fee. It's an annual registration fee for controlled rent is charged to property owners by the Rent Control Board unless there is a fee waiver that is granted. Currently, the fee is $228 per year per unit. And as long as an owner pays the annual fee on time, usually by August 1st, 50% of the registration fee may be passed through to each tenant by including an additional $9.50 per month at the tenant's rent. If you pay the registration fee late, then there will be no pass-through of the 50%. Next slide. So some of the registration fee waivers would be low-income elderly and low-income disabled tenants that could apply for this fee waiver. Owners may apply for a registration fee waiver for units occupied by Section 8 tenants. Owners also holding at least 25% interest in the property and is occupying a unit as their principal place of residency may apply for a fee waiver as well. If a fee waiver is approved, registration fee are not charged to the unit and there can be no registration fee pass-through charged to that tenant of that unit. So the amounts for low income levels would be for one person roughly $23,000. For two people households, it will be roughly $38,000. But if you're looking to apply for this fee waiver, and you know one of your tenants is a low income tenant, you could always have the tenant give us a call and we would be able to provide that form for the tenant or for yourself. Next slide. So the next component is the allowable surcharges. Allowable surcharges are based on the owner's property tax bill. These costs can be divided among units on the property and passed through to the tenants. The surcharges for existing tenancy are capped at 4% of the MAR or $35, whichever is less. Surcharges cannot be passed through for new tenancy beginning March 1st, 2018, or if the building was sold or its value was reassessed on or after that day. So another thing is when a low income tenant could also, so I'll be going over the different property taxes that can be passed through, and one of them would be a clean beach and ocean parcel tax. And a low income tenant that receives a fee waiver would also be able to apply for a fee waiver of the clean beaches as well. Next slide. So this is an example of the notice that we provide to the landlord, and I'll be going over the notice a little bit more in detail in the next slides, but the specific costs for the property tax bill are listed on the notice of change of terms of tenancy form, and it's labeled 5A through 5E, and the 5 items that you could pass through would be the community college bond, unified schools bond, school district parcel tax, which is also labeled as SMMUSD-MEAS-R. The fourth is the Santa Monica Stormwater Management User Fee, and the last is the Clean Beaches and Ocean Parcel Tax. So you would use the property tax to fill this section out. Next slide. So rent control provides a blank form to the landlords that they may use as the required written notice to implement the general adjustment each year. So you could expect to receive this with the MAR report, which is a sample would be the chart that's on the top left corner around June, so that you could implement it in time for the September increases. So you'll be using the MAR report and the property taxes to fill out this notice of change in terms of tenancy. When you receive the MAR report, you'll see that each column will be labeled 1, 2, or 3, and they correspond to the numbers on the notice of change in terms of tenancy form. If you follow the arrows, it's labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and the property taxes are also corresponding to this box. So if you just look at these two documents, you'll be able to fill out the rest of the form. Next slide. So one of the taxes, you as a landlord may be qualified for the exemption. The exemption for this tax are available to property owners who meet the following qualifications. You must be 65 years or older by June 30th of the year in which you apply, and occupy the property as a primary residence. The application are available by contacting Santa Monica Malibu School District, Unified School District at 450-8338, extension 70263. When this waiver is granted, no school district parcel tax is charged for the property, and no school district parcel tax surcharge may be passed through to any tenants of the property. Next slide. So there is also a clean beach and ocean parcel tax exemption. Exemptions are available for low-income owners who qualify and apply. If granted, no clean beaches and ocean parcel tax will be charged, and no surcharges may be included for the specific category may be included in the rent for any tenants on that property. You could contact Curtis Castle, and a pro-rata waiver of the tax is also available for the unit of any low-income tenants that apply. If granted, no Clean Beach is an ocean parcel tax surcharge may be charged to that specific tenant's unit. Next slide. Do you guys have any questions?
All right. Thank you, Jenny. Just see one question regarding the rent, and that's did Measure RC pass a maximum allowable increase of $70? Yes, so that is for the current year. So from September 1st, 2022 through August 31st of 2023, the average maximum increase for the year would be $70. Going forward, that maximum dollar is per a calculation that is in the rent control law, and they didn't specify that it would be limited to $70. It's relative to the calculation that is in the rent control law. Jenny mentioned that the general adjustment is based on the March to March CPI and 75% of the CPI, and that will be announced at the board meeting on May 11th. And then the board will set a public hearing for June, and at that time they will consider whether or not to apply the formula that is in the rent control law to set a maximum dollar increase. So stay tuned. The GA will be announced at the May meeting, and then we'll have a public hearing in early June. Then we will send out the report of maximum allowable rents that Jenny showed you, and a form that can be used for this year's increase. We want everybody to know that because of Measure GA, the maximum allowable rents were reduced from a 6% increase to the August 2022 rent to a 0.8% increase from February. But next year's general adjustment is going to assume a 3% increase on the August 2022 rent. So we're going to catch back up to 3%. Many owners have been charging 3% across the board, and so they will be taking whatever percentage increase is allowed by this year's general adjustment in September. Do we have? So we have a question about AB 1482. This actually is a state law that limits rent increases to properties that are not subject to rent control. And again, we do want to focus on those units that are subject to rent control. My general understanding of AB 1482 is that owners can increase rents CPI plus 5%, but not to exceed 10%. But since that is not a rent control law, we again would refer you to the state to get information about what limitations there are on rent increases for non-rent controlled units. Does the 3% increase apply to only this year also? So this year we're averaging a 3% increase for that period I described, but Measure RC changed the maximum of any year's increase going forward to no more than 3%. It used to be 6%, and with very high inflation last year, I think it was about 8.5%, and then we used 75% of that, which was over 6%, and the cap was applied at 6%. So, and then on the property tax bill, what can be passed on to tenants after 1999? Well, just to go back, so you'll see on the form that we provide, we list in Section C, the allowable surcharges that can be passed through from the property tax bill. And the sample tax bill in the lower left corner has those items in bold. They're not really in bold on your tax bill, but that's where you're going to find them. And you would just enter the amounts that are on the 2022 tax bill this year. So you'll use the prior year's tax bill, enter those into the amounts column, and then divide by the number of units on the property, and then divide by 12 months to get the monthly amount. And then there are some limitations. Those surcharges cannot exceed $35. And again, if a property, if the tenancy began after March 1st, 2018, or if the property was sold or reassessed after that date, then owners can no longer pass on surcharges. So if you are a new owner and you are collecting the same rent that the old owner collected, you might be collecting excess rent. So you want to check to see what you're actually charging the tenant. And if it includes surcharges, you do need to take those off, or the tenants could file excess rent complaints with us. All right, I don't think any other questions regarding this. Going back, somebody asked, after a one-year term, can tenancies be month to month? Yes. It's just that the initial term has to be a minimum. Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll go on to petitions and complaints, like charging excess rent. So we'll go back to Micah for this.
All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me better now. I switched over to a wired internet connection rather than a wireless one. So let's go on to the next slide. All right. So just like Dan was just talking about, complaints for excess rent, the remedies that tenants have for various situations during their tenancies are dealt through an administrative process and petitions. One of the petition processes the board has as a remedy for tenants who are overpaying their rent is an excess rent petition. So complaints for excess rent may be filed by tenants who believe they are being or have been charged amounts that exceed what is allowed by the rent control law. If a hearing decision determines that excess rent has been collected, the tenant will be authorized to withhold rent until the excess rent has been recovered. Interest and penalties can also be included in the amount of an award. Next slide, please. All right, so some common examples of excess rent. If a landlord were to increase the rent for an additional occupant, charge for unregistered additional amenities, adding utility charges, not providing proper notice of a rent increase, or improper pass-through of surcharges. So just like Dan was talking about with those tenants that moved in or properties that were sold or reassessed after March 1st of 2018, if you are charging those when you shouldn't be, that would be excess rent. Next slide, please. So one question that's coming up a lot lately is, can tenants be charged separately for utility costs? So where a unit is separately metered and the tenant pays the utility company directly, a tenant could be required to pay utility costs. Property is master metered and the lease requires the tenant to pay a share of the monthly utility bill. The owner must specify the exact dollar amount at the start of the tenancy that becomes part of the MAR, and the whole MAR is increased every year by the general adjustment. So the use of ratio utility billing systems, or RUBS, is not permissible because that creates a fluctuating amount to be charged. That could put you above the maximum allowable rent, and that would be excess rent. So cannot charge for utilities above the MAR. Next slide, please. All right, petitions for a rent decrease. Tenants may file a petition for a rent decrease when necessary repairs are neglected or for the reduction or removal of amenities or housing services. If a rent decrease is granted, it will remain in effect until the repairs are made or amenities or services are restored. Owners who wish to remove a base amenity or housing service may file a decrease petition. We're seeing this a lot lately with people who want to build ADUs to add more housing. They may have to remove some amenities to do that, and to find out what a fair amount to reduce the tenants who are impacted and losing amenities, what that would be, they're able to file a rent decrease petition for that process. Go ahead and next slide, please. All right, what maintenance is required? In addition to state law and other local laws, rent control regulations provide remedies for failure to make necessary repairs inside a unit and in common areas. These might include issues regarding water supply, water leakage, worn paint, heat, elevators, porches, counters, smoke alarms, screens, insect, appliances, dangerous walkways, broken windows or doors, electrical problems, plumbing problems, anything like that. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but it does kind of give you a general idea of what maintenance is required. Go ahead, next slide, please. All right, so base amenities and housing services. So rather than the maintenance, decrease may be awarded for amenities and housing services that were provided on the base rent date, or as well as those required by law. They must be continued to be maintained and provided. If they are not provided, and this is that base housing, that base rent date that we talked about before. We'll talk about that actually on the next slide as well. But examples may include things like parking, storage, flooring, floor coverings, so carpet, stove, refrigerator, other appliances, window coverings, screens, smoke alarms, the right to have roommates, the right to have overnight guests, the right to have a pet. This does include services to common areas such as gardening, laundry, on-site management, rec rooms, if there's a pool, a gym, things like that. So next slide, please. So how are these base amenities determined? For pre-January 1st, 1999 tenancies, the date for determining the base amenities and housing services is April 10th, 1978, or if a unit was not rented then, the first date that it was rented thereafter. So this is the original registration when the property first, or the unit first became subject to rent control. But for post-January 1st, 1999 tenancies, the date for determining those base amenities and housing services is the date that the current tenancy began, or when the separate agreement was made. Not the separate agreement, but when the, we wouldn't have a separate agreement for post-99 tenancies. Sorry about that slide there. But when the, if the additional amenity was registered, that would be when the base date would be for that. Next slide, please. All right, we also have construction-related rent decreases. These may be granted when a unit is uninhabitable due to construction, when construction substantially reduces a housing service, or when construction interferes with a tenant's ability to occupy the unit as a resident. No decrease is authorized for unavoidable construction impacts caused by necessary repairs or maintenance issues, unless the construction is carried out in an unreasonable manner or the construction takes an unreasonably long time to complete. Regulation 4400 sets a decrease range for many possible issues, and decreases are calculated based on when the problem arose, when the impacts were first felt. And we do try to mediate these kind of petitions first, as well as with the other kind of decrease petition. We do try to get everything done through mediation first, if possible. One area that we're seeing a lot of requests for construction-related decreases, but they are not granted, is when seismic retrofit is done. If that is done in a reasonable way and under a reasonable amount of time, there is no decrease that is granted to the tenants because that is necessary and mandated work. But for more discretionary work, that is the bulk of the construction-related decreases that we see. Go ahead, next slide, please. So are there other times when the MAR can be adjusted? We do have another petition. It's called a tenant not in occupancy petition, and the owner may file a petition for an increase when the owner believes that a tenant does not use their unit as a primary residence. If this is proven at a hearing, the Rent Control Board will grant a one-time market rate increase. There are some formulas that need to be followed to come up with that number. So it is not just an arbitrary market rate. There's some calculations that need to be done either based on comparables in the building or comparables in the neighborhood if there are no comparable units that have been recently rented in the building. But it can increase the rent substantially for that tenant. It is not a just cause for eviction or a reason to terminate the tenancy, but it does allow the landlord to raise the rent to a market rate, close to a market rate. Individual rent increase petitions may also be filed. An owner may file a petition for a rent increase based on unusually high expenses, such as capital improvements. These petitions must include all of the units on the property, and it is based on the net operating income from 1978, adjusted for inflation. So if your operating expenses have exceeded what the operating expenses were and the revenue that was taken in back in 1978, which was presumed to be a fair return because that was operating in an unregulated market before rent control began, then you would be qualified for a rent increase petition. Next slide, please. All right, so we talked a little bit about mediation. How effective is that mediation? Well, we had 78 decrease petitions filed in 2022, 15 excess rent petitions filed in 2022, and 11 construction-related petitions filed. 44% of decrease petitions were mediated and fully or partially resolved. 67% of excess rent complaints were resolved after administrative or formal mediation, and 43% of construction petitions were fully mediated and resolved. So it has shown to be very effective and saved everybody a lot of time versus going all the way to a hearing. So please do take advantage of those mediation services if you are able to and you need to. Next slide, please. I think we're ready for any questions on this section.
All right, thank you, Micah, and we can hear you much better this time. We do have a few questions related to this. Does the rent decrease request for common area amenities get backdated from the date of removal of the amenities, when the amenities were removed? Micah, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so it depends on what type of petition is filed. If the removal of common area amenities is part of the construction-related decrease, that does go back to when the impacts were first felt. If this is a regular amenity or maintenance-related decrease petition, that decrease actually just goes back to the first time rent is due after the petition was filed with our office. So there is a period of time where the tenant has to provide written notice to the landlord. That takes 30 days, and then they're able to file their petition. And then the first time rent is due after that petition is filed is the date that our hearings department would look back to for awarding any kind of a decrease should one be given to the tenant.
All right, and the next question was, do landlords have to pay when the tenant clogs the sink or toilet?
Yeah, so I mean that's part of the maintenance of the property is providing that plumbing maintenance. If the tenant caused the issue, there are remedies that are available for the landlord to go after the tenant to reimburse them for the costs of the plumbing work if the tenant was negligent in causing those issues. But the initial maintenance itself needs to be taken care of by the landlord.
That's right. Also, is there a specific number for taking away parking in the reduction of rent? And I'll take this because I have that section open. So the rent control law specifies a range of decrease amounts for a lot of the common conditions. And a hearing officer, when deciding the amount of the rent reduction, looks at this regulation, but there's quite a range in there for any particular thing. For example, with parking, the range is from $30 a month to $550 a month. Now, why is there such a range? Well, it could be the difference between, say, a separate two-car garage versus a tandem space. The hearing officer also looks at the amount of rent that is paid by a tenant. So there are things that need to be looked at. So it's not an easy answer. Typically, I can say it's generally what is the going rate for parking in an area? What is the availability of parking in an area? So all of those factors can influence the amount that the hearing officer decides. But as you can see, it's from $30 a month to $550. It's a big range. So one of the base housing services that we consider is the number of occupants that were allowed per the rental agreement. So just as with any other amenity, when the rent was set, tenants consider, well, how many people get to live here? So let's say there are two people on a rental agreement and one of the tenants leaves, the remaining tenant can replace the departed tenant on a one-for-one basis. They should provide the name of that person in writing to the landlord. And if a landlord refuses to allow that tenant to have that base housing service, then the tenant can file a petition for rent decrease. And the regulations say that it's proportional to, the decrease would be proportional to the percentage of tenants no longer allowed. So if two people were originally allowed and only one was allowed after that, then there could be a 50% reduction in the rent. So tenants should, though, inform owners because rental agreements typically require that the tenant inform the owner if there is an additional occupant. You don't have to allow more occupants than were originally provided on the rental agreement. Yeah, I think that answers that. Let's see. The other thing, we had some kind of offline questions about roommates and caregivers. So it really depends on what the rental agreement says. So if the rental agreement limits occupancy to the unit to a certain number of people, then the landlord can enforce that. One difference may be for pre-99 tenants, because as we said, the base amenities and housing services that are provided to tenants who moved in before 1999 go back to April 10th of 1978. So if, for example, 3 people lived in the unit in 1978, then that's the base housing service. And if an owner doesn't allow 3 people or a pre-99 tenant to continue, then the tenant can file the petition for rent decrease. There are also sometimes caregivers who may reside in a unit. I think the major concern for a property owner is that this person may attempt to establish their tenancy in the unit. Typically, we have a statement that you can ask tenants to provide, or a caregiver to provide, to say that they are not intending to establish a tenancy. They should have an address other than the controlled rental unit. But some of these things, may have to do with rights under federal law, and I would suggest this is kind of to deal with this on a case by case basis. Maybe call us. We may refer you to the city attorney's office to get more information about what's allowed. And question is, can we require the incoming replacement tenant to complete a rental application and background check? Well, there really are two parts to this. One is the base housing service. So if two tenants were on the rental agreement and one of them leaves, it's only the remaining tenant who has the direct relationship with the property owner, and that remaining tenant is responsible for the full rent. Now, they should be able to replace the roommate on a one-for-one basis, and it has to be done in a reasonable way. If the owner is unreasonable and refuses to allow the tenant to replace the roommate, maybe by doing excessive background checks or requiring certain things, it may be that a hearing officer might decide that that the property owner was being unreasonable and could reduce the rent. But since there's also the other part of this has to do with the eviction protections under the rent control law. So one of the eviction protections is, one of the reasons for evicting tenants might be because they are violating the rental agreement by subletting the unit. There's an exception to this right to eviction if the subtenant replaces a tenant on a one-for-one basis. So someone on the rental agreement on a one-for-one basis, the original tenant still lives there, and that the owner has not unreasonably refused after getting a written notice from the named tenant of the person that they're seeking to replace. So they could accept rent from their subtenant and then pay the owner the total rent that's due. And then we would still add them as an occupant with no tenant rights. We can't really provide legal advice, but you may want to consider whether or not you want to establish direct relationships with subtenants or replacement occupants. And I would mention that if your named tenant departs the unit and informs you in writing, but you continue to collect rent from the subtenant, then you would be establishing a tenancy with that person at the rent that you collected. So, if you just have to be careful, if you get a notice that your primary tenant is terminating their tenancy and there's somebody else in the unit, you may need to get legal advice on that. And I don't see any other questions, so we'll go on to the next section. And we are back to Jenny. Jenny, I'm not able to hear you. All right, while Jenny's trying to work that out, let me go ahead and talk to you about eviction. So we just talked about evictions a bit, but The rent control law, one of the four legs that Micah was describing are eviction protections for tenants. And so the reasons for which you can terminate a tenancy are limited under the rent control law. If you want to know, you can look at the Charter Amendment, and it's section 1806, and it lists the reasons. For most reasons for a tenancy termination, you do need to send a copy of the eviction notice to rent control and to the city attorney's office. The only exception is for non-payment of rent. You do not need to send any eviction notice to us. Some types of eviction, such as a lease violation or nuisance, or refusing access to the landlord to the unit when the landlord does have a lawful right to enter, require that a warning notice first be served on the tenant. And this warning notice has to give them a reasonable amount of time to comply. And then if they do not, then you can serve an eviction notice. Once that notice requirement to send a copy to us is met, we are generally not involved in any kind of eviction action. That all happens in the courts. There are a number of requirements, though, for eviction for owner occupancy. Jenny, are you with us yet? No. Okay. So let me just back up and talk about the different types of eviction. So there are what we call fault evictions and no fault evictions. Obviously, fault evictions are things that the tenant does wrong, like not paying the rent, violating the lease, being a nuisance, and refusing lawful access. There are some others that allow an owner to evict a tenant, such as owner occupancy, withdrawal of the property of from the rental housing business under the State Ellis Act, and a removal permit. And for most no-fault evictions, there are specific requirements that must be met in the municipal code, including paying a permanent relocation fee. And the very key thing to note is that the end of the lease is not a reason to terminate the tenancy. So going back to those evictions for owner occupancy, Jen, if you're there, you can take over.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you now.
Okay, I don't know what happened there, but I'll continue on now. There are some limitations to owner occupancy evictions, and I'll be going through some of them. Owners must be a natural person with at least 50% ownership. Owners can evict for a close family member, so their father, mother, daughter, son, so forth. They must intend to move in within 60 days of evicting, of the unit being vacated, and occupy the unit as a primary residence for at least 2 years. And this number has changed from Measure RC. So before, they had to move in within 30 days and had to live in that unit for only a year, but it changed to 60 days, moving in within 60 days, and then living in that specific unit for at least 2 years. You would not be able to owner occupy if the landlord or relative already occupies a unit in that property. Rent may be charged for subsequential re-rent is restricted. And I'll be going through a little bit more specific details on some of the other restrictions in the next slide. Next slide, Dan. So tenants who are terminally ill or have been living in their unit for 5 years and are over 62 or disabled cannot be evicted for owner occupancy unless the evicting owner is also at least 62, disabled, or terminally ill. Relocation benefit payments must be placed in an escrow account for the tenant who is being evicted. And The permanent relocation amounts vary depending on the number of units or the number of bedrooms in that unit. And tenants of a TORCA condominium unit who are participating tenants, so generally tenants that were tenants at the time of the conversion, may not be evicted for owner occupancy. Next slide. So other restrictions on selecting a unit would be that you cannot evict for a unit if there is a comparable unit on the property that is already vacant, and you cannot evict from a unit if there is a comparable unit on the property that has been occupied by a current tenant for a shorter amount of time. And comparable means the same number of bedrooms with square footage that varies by no more than 15%. Next slide. So the City of Santa Monica also has eviction limitation. Good cause eviction protections have been extended to tenants in multi-unit buildings that are not subjected to rent control law. The following limitation applies to rent-controlled and non-rent controlled property. So the municipal code provides a substantive defense against no-fault eviction if a child under the age of 18 or an educator lives in the unit, or a child or educator is a tenant in that unit or has a custodial or parent or family relationship with a tenant in that unit, and a tenant has lived in the unit for 12 months or more, and the date of the tenant must move out of the unit falls during the school year. So if there's a minor or there's a teacher living there, you will not be able to evict during the school year. Next slide. So I'll be going over the local and county eviction moratorium. Both of the one in Santa Monica and the LA County have expired. I will be first going over the Santa Monica ones. So residential tenants were protected from the following kinds of evictions. No-fault eviction, including owner occupancy, refusing entry into the unit with limited health and safety expectations, having unauthorized occupants or their pets with limited health and safety expectations, nuisance, and eviction for Ellis evictions. There was a temporary eviction moratorium specific for rent-controlled tenants, and this was for non-payment of rent, or for basically rent that was due between September 1st to 2022 through January 31st, 2023. The unit had to be under rent control, and the rent control rent had to be increased by more than 3% above the MAR in place prior to September 1st, 2022. And tenants could not pay the covered rent due to a COVID-19 related financial distress, and the tenants provide notice and documentation to the landlord of the inability to pay due to COVID-19. So under the Santa Monica temporary eviction moratorium for these rent control tenants, qualifying tenants still owe the rent and must pay the covered rent back by September 1st, 2023. And you would be able to find more information by going onto our city website. So it would be santamonica.gov/coronavirus eviction moratorium. Next slide. So this next, on this slide, we'll be talking about the Los Angeles County moratorium. So this has also expired, and this eviction protection was for non-payment of rent, including self-certification to establish affirmative defense for households with income at or below 80% area mean income due to COVID-19 financial hardship for rent incurring on or after July 1st, 2022. And to be protected, tenants must have provided notice to their landlord within 7 days of rent due every month that rent is due. And so because this is a county eviction moratorium, you'll be able to find out more information by going to dcba.lacounty.gov/no evictions for more information. One thing I do want to mention is if an owner was planning on Ellis acting, so removing the units out of the rental business, owners may serve a requisite notice for an Ellis Act eviction, but shall not file an eviction based on removal of the unit from the market under the Ellis Act until 60 days after February 28th, 2023. So that means the date would be 60 days after that day would be April 29th, 2023. And as I mentioned, you would be able to get more information by visiting or calling the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs. And do we have any questions regarding this topic?
Don't see that we do. Anybody has a question, go ahead and put it in and we'll come back to it. We're running out of time, so I'm going to move right on to the limitations on the change of use. Rent control limits the change of use of rent-controlled units. They are supposed to be used for the long-term habitation of tenants, but there are a few situations that would allow the unit to have its use changed. Those include removal permits, the Ellis Act, which we've mentioned a couple of times, and whenever it's a no-fault eviction, again, the tenants do have to be paid permanent relocation per a schedule that is set by the city. So what is a removal permit? So a removal permit may be granted by the board, and again, it does have to be granted by the rent control board. So to remove a unit from the rental housing market by demolition, conversion, or other means. And what would be the reasons for that? There are really only two. One is that the unit is uninhabitable and it is not economically feasible to make it habitable. We don't have that many of those anymore, but sometimes we come across these bootleg units that aren't supposed to be rented, but they were somehow registered with rent control, but they cannot be made habitable. And so no one can live there. They need to be removed. In those cases, the owner does have to apply for a removal permit and then pay the tenant permanent relocation. The other one is the property is going to be redeveloped. And these removal permits are granted by an agreement with the rent control board that replacement units will be built on the newly developed property. And the number of units that need to be rebuilt needs to equal the number of units that were removed, so that we maintain the same number of units in the housing stock. There is also a requirement for a removal permit of this kind for redevelopment that would require that at least, I believe it's 15% of the units on the new property be set aside to be affordable to tenants of low income. We don't see a lot of removal permits today, but I think we had 2 or so maybe last year, typically just to redevelop the property. We see them from affordable housing producers. And removal permits do expire if they're not acted on. So we will follow up and ensure that the unit is no longer rented. You can't get a removal permit and continue to rent the unit. The Ellis Act is a state law that allows an owner to go out of the rental housing business. They evict all the tenants if there are any on the property, As Jenny mentioned, there has been a moratorium in place on evictions for Ellis withdrawal, but those are ending at the end of this month. As such, we have not seen a lot of Ellis activity last year. Some of it was on exempt properties, and some of it was on vacant units. But the owners wanted to redevelop or something like that. So they withdrew the properties under the Ellis Act. The requirement is that a notice of intent to withdraw is filed with the Rent Control Board, and then a notice of termination on tenants must be properly served. So this makes sure that all of the tenants on a property are notified of the owner's intent to withdraw. Again, relocation benefits must be paid. And the eviction limitations are that tenants must, initially the termination is 120 days, but if a tenant is 62 years of age or older or disabled, they can request a 1-year extension. And if they do, the withdrawal of the property is also 1 year. So don't evict some tenants after 120 days and others after 1 year. State law changed and said there's only one withdrawal date for Ellis withdrawals. Ellis withdrawals cannot be completed during a tenant's lease term. So if you have a 1-year lease with the tenant, you can't terminate their tenancy within that year just because you want to withdraw the property. And individual condo units may not be withdrawn. The law defines units that may be withdrawn as accommodations, and it's either the whole building or a building with 4 units or more. Condos cannot be withdrawn. If Ellis units are re-rented within 2 years of the withdrawal, the displaced tenants and the city can sue the owner for damages. For that reason, we typically do not see owners returning within 2 years of evicting tenants, but it has happened, and owners are liable for doing that. If the unit is rented within 5 years of the withdrawal, it must be rented at the rent-controlled rate, plus any general adjustments that may have occurred. So the rent on the date that the tenant was evicted plus general adjustments, but you cannot set a market rate rent after withdrawing the property if you come back within 5 years. If the units are demolished and the property is redeveloped and new units are rented within 5 years, all of those new units are subject to rent control. The owner would be able to set the market rate rent with those units, but then they would again be controlled and annual increases would be limited to the general adjustment. For a 10-year period, if units are re-rented, the owner has to offer the unit back to the tenant who was displaced. If it's after 5 years, they can rent those units, they can offer it back at a market rate, but in any case, they do have to offer it back to the tenant, and we have seen tenants accept those offers even after 5 years. And tenants, if they're not offered their unit back, can obtain a judgment against the owner equal to 6 times the monthly rent when it was withdrawn. And once a unit has been withdrawn, the city requires that there be some reoccupancy permit if it's going to be occupied. So that includes family occupancy or owner occupancy, and we do follow up on properties that are Ellis and investigate, and we will report to code enforcement if a unit is occupied without a reoccupancy permit. And kind of last, another way to gain control of a unit or possession of a unit is through a buyout agreement. These are voluntary agreements between tenants and landlords. You, as a landlord or a property owner, cannot coerce the tenant into a buyout agreement. It's up to them. You also must give them a statement of their rights. That QR code there on the screen is the document that must be provided to a tenant if you are going to approach them about a buyout offer. So that needs to be given to them in advance of the offer. Tenants do have a right to refuse, so they don't have to enter into a buyout agreement. They have the right to consult an attorney and or rent control if they are considering signing. And they also have the right to cancel the agreement up to 30 days after they sign it. Rent control requires that all buyout agreements be filed with our agency. We do wait the 30 days when a tenant could back out. So between 31 and 60 days is when the owner or property manager has to file a copy of the buyout agreement with our office. So we keep those confidential, but we do report on our website. We update it, I think, every quarter with the average buyout amounts that tenants are accepting. You can see from the tables there that there were 24 buyout offers accepted last year and that were recorded with our office, and they averaged $43,496. It really varies depending on the unit size, how long the tenant has been there, maybe what the rent is, what the market rate potential of a unit is, how motivated the owner is to regain possession of the unit. But typically the amounts are well above the permanent relocation that would have to be paid if an owner had the right to evict a tenant for a no-fault reason. Again, these are always available on our website, and you can check the current status of buyout agreements there. And with that, we'll have one more chance to ask questions. I know it's getting late. We just went past 6:30. We appreciate everybody, those of you who have stayed with us the duration. I'm not seeing any other questions. If you have any, go ahead and post them. But again, if you do have questions, you can certainly contact our office. We are always here. As I said, we'll post this presentation on our website. And I want to let you know the next rent control board meeting is Thursday, May 11th. There's also that is the next board meeting. They'll have a second meeting in May as a budget study session. But you can reach us at 310-458-8751. We answer the phone. We take a lot of email requests for information. And our website has a lot of information, including we just posted our 2022 annual report, which provides a summary of what the department activities have been, but also a couple of studies that are interesting. The impact of market rate vacancies, or the Costa-Hawkins law, how are rents changing in Santa Monica from year to year, and the impact of the Ellis Act. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I saw somebody say wow a couple times. That's fine. We're here to provide you information. And if you've learned something today, then that's great. Again, we're always available as situations come up. We want to help you. We want to help you comply with the law, avoid problems. And I'm sure we'll be hearing from you at some point. Thank you very much.